All right, so today we're going to be talking about new development containers for SPFx samples. This is a crazy concept. I'm going to be going fast. I apologize because there's probably like an hour and a half's worth of material in here. But let's see what we can do. All right, so if you look at your SPFx or SharePoint Framework development environment, right, there's an article that tells you what you need to do. And one of the first things that we tell you to do is you should install Node, right? And we tell you you should install Node 1.14. Now, here's the problem, is every version of the SharePoint framework, and this is an article that's available on the docs.microsoft.com, but every version of the SharePoint framework potentially is only compatible with certain versions of Node.js, right? Because obviously Node.js is evolving, and so is the SharePoint framework. So as you can see here that and this is soon to be obsolete, I guess, as per Visa's announcement, but the latest version is 1.13.1, right? And it's compatible with Node 12 and 14. But if we look at maybe 1.12.1, it was compatible with 10, 12, and 14. And if we go all the way down to, let's say, version 1.4.1, because maybe you're running on an earlier version of SharePoint, it's only compatible with Node 6 and Node 8. Now, here's the problem, is that we can only install one version of Node at the same time on your workstation. Yes, there's techniques that you can use Node Version Manager or NVM, and if you're interested in that, we have a sharing and scaling session where we show you exactly how to do that. David does a great demonstration of how to set it up. But let's go take a look at some of the issues that we're seeing with the SPFx samples and extensions and things like that. Probably for every 10 issues that we see, 9 of them with a plus or minus 1 error margin is actually related to a node compatibility. So someone is downloading an old version of a SharePoint sample, and these samples have been around for probably like 5 years now. So someone's downloading an old sample that was designed for SharePoint 1.4, SPFx 1.4.1, and they're trying to run it in like Node, 72 or something, like a super new version of Node, which doesn't even exist right now. And they're reporting issues and of course, there's nothing really that tells you in a friendly way that this is the wrong version of Node. So how do we deal with that, right? If we have all these issues that are being related to Node compatibility. So let's go take a look at what these samples do for us, right? So if we go to an example web part here, which is the enhanced Power App web part, we see if on every README document for every sample has a compatibility section. And they all have the version of SharePoint framework that it uses, the version of Node that it is compatible with. In this case, it looks like it only works with that version of Node for whatever reason. But new and improved, we now have the ability to actually create remote containers. And a lot of the samples have remote containers. Now you might say, what's a remote container? Well, imagine if I was able to say, I'm going to create a virtual machine that is a separate machine somewhere, that you don't even know where it runs. Like in theory, it runs on your machine, but it could be in the cloud. And it's going to have all the dependencies, all the environment settings, and everything you need to do to actually run this particular sample. But think also about the other scenarios. How many times, well, I'm sure that's never happened to you, but how many times have you been on a project where the new developer joins and it takes them 2 weeks to even get set up with having the ability to build the project because there's so many crazy dependencies and so many undocumented things that happens. Now imagine if you're able to package that entire project and entire solution into a container that actually is stored in source control with or the definition at least, is stored in source control with the solution. And the act of opening that solution in a container opens all the dependencies you need to actually run that solution. Now that's pretty awesome, and that's not just limited to samples. So let's actually show you how this works. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open that exact same sample in Visual Studio Code. Now, one thing that you'll notice in the corner, when I open the sample, I actually get a prompt. Now, I choose to have that prompt show up for me. You don't have to be prompted every time. But it says, hey, this folder contains a dev container configuration. You can actually reopen this solution in that bubble, in that world that has all the dependencies. And if you click on that, let's see if we can make that happen. If you click on reopen in container, what we should see, let's see if it happened. Now, the other option is if you choose not to get prompted, you can actually just click on the menu or click on that little fancy little thing in the corner and say reopen in container. Either way, what will happen is we'll actually take that same solution and we'll launch it. It will launch Visual Studio Code again, but now it's actually running in a server or in a container that is dedicated for this solution. And for just to be transparent here, I didn't cut any of these videos. I did speed up some of them in some cases because like doing an npm install and watching me do an npm install can be boring. But what you're seeing here is actually it has reopened the solution, but now it's actually coming from a different world. You might even see like the prompt is actually no longer I run on Windows machine. This is not your usual Windows prompt, right? Because it's running in a Linux container. And you can actually see that if you look in the corner here, right here, it says you're editing it on a dev container. We've labeled it as an SPFx 113 container. And so this is actually really cool. Now, just for fun, let's take a look at what happens when I go to my terminal within that container and I just type, if I can actually type, gulp build. Now, I just opened the solution. I didn't do npm install. I didn't do anything like that. I just ran gulp build, and it already builds automatically, and that's cool. And we'll talk about how this works. There's like a lot of voodoo behind this, but it allows you to actually be able to build a solution pretty much instantly from opening it, regardless of the version. Now, think about, for those of you who are actually running, maybe they're still on SharePoint 2016, 2019, or maybe their organization has decided to, due to policies, as per AC's comments, due to policies, they've decided, no, we're not going to go past this version of SPFx for whatever reason, or this version of Node for whatever reason. Now you're able to actually satisfy these kind of requirements by doing this. Now, let's look at the version of Node that's running in this environment. So if I type node-v, right? If I could actually type, that is node-v, it'll tell me that it's running version 14.18, sorry. Now, if I actually launched this solution outside the container, and so, again, this is going to be confusing, but there's basically the solution can run within the container or something that's called remote, or it can be launched locally, which is really from within my machine only. Let's take a look at what happens. So if I say, let's just close this whole project, let's reopen it. One thing you'll notice is in the recent solutions that show up at the top there, you'll see that it says I have the enhanced Power App web part as a dev container, and I have the enhanced Power App as just a regular project. So I'm going to click on that. Now it's actually reopening this solution on my machine locally, right? And you'll notice that my terminal is actually very different. My prompt is very different because it's actually now running PowerShell in my machine. And if I was to type node here, node-v, again, that's a big assumption, assuming that I'm able to actually type node-v. My machine is actually running 12.20.2. So that's kind of cool. Now let's do something a little crazier. let me actually go to, well, behind the scenes here, I actually replaced the Node version of on my computer to something really old. Now, this video is not cut. I just sped up the boring parts, but let's show you the differences here. All right, so again, I'm going to type node-v. This is my local machine. It's running node 421. So from many, many years ago. And if I do a gulp build on my local machine, I obviously don't have the environment requirements to be able to run this project. And Node will tell me, maybe not so helpfully, that it can't do that. Right now, you need to have a magic decoder ring to actually understand that this is not the right version. But let me reopen that same solution in the container. Again, the container has all the definition of what that solution needs to be able to run with all the dependencies and environment variables and everything. So this is actually opening now in a virtual machine. It's giving me that new fancy prompt. And if I do the same thing, I do a gulp build, or I was going to do node version first, just to demonstrate again that this is running in node 14. Now, if I do a gulp build, what we should see is that it's actually going to build without any dependencies, right? So this is kind of slow and boring, so let's speed that up a little bit. All right, I skipped the whole part here, so you don't have to watch me do this. Now, let's take a look at a little bit more what's happening here. So if I close this window again, and I open a completely different project, a project I've never opened. Well, I mean, in reality, I've opened it because I had to configure it, but I went and deleted all my settings and everything. I reopened a brand new project, and this is going to be the experience you're going to get when you're going to download samples from the sample galleries. You're actually going to get the same thing. It's going to prompt you. Again, it's up to you to decide whether you want to be prompted or not. And then what it's going to do is it's going to switch into the container. It's actually going to provision a container for this machine, as you can see here. And then what it's going to do is we've already pre-configured every sample. Well, okay. The only samples that are published right now are 113, but I have pull requests that I'm going to submit to actually, we're going through 112 and all that stuff. We are testing every sample as we go through this process. But look at what happens. As soon as you open the solution, it automatically sets all the dependencies. It finds out the right version of Node, finds out the dependencies, all the tools that you need to do this. It takes care of that all for you, right? And then what it does is it generates a certificate for for this machine, because keep in mind, even though you're running this in theory from your local workstation, this is a remote container, right? So it needs its own certificate. And that's normally what you would do if you did gulp trust dev. I can never remember the command, but you know that one, the trust dev certificate. So it's generating the certificate for us, and it's doing that. Now, if we can show you the files on that solution, one thing that you should see eventually, if it's, and you can see the videos is sped up by how fast the thing is spinning in the bottom taskbar here. But eventually what should happen is these certificates should actually show up automatically added to the solution. There you go. So we have a CER file for, I guess, Windows, and a PEM file for anybody that can't really deal with certificate files. They automatically get generated for you and get added to your project. Now, this is a remote container, so that means that those files are not actually physically being created on your machine. You would have to actually download them and install them on your machine. But if I did a gulp serve here, and of course, this is running in a remote container, so I have to do no browser, because if I did gulp serve, it would try to launch a browser in that machine, and there's no browser installed on that machine because it's a remote thing. So I can actually go to the certificate, go download it on my machine. I'll just I downloaded a few versions of this, but I'll go download it on my machine, and then I'll go install it using whatever mechanism for your workstation you would need to do. And then if we speed that up a little bit here, once I've actually, done the gulp serve, eventually I get the fancy reload, which is telling me, hey, now it's time to go refresh my page, right? Let's go take a look at what happens. Now, as it's doing this, one thing that we've configured the machines to do is they will actually open the ports that they need to be able to work on your machine. So it's just going to rebind that remote containers port to your local container. So in this case, in a SPFx 12 or above, you're going to get the manifest and the live reload. If it's an older sample, you have, I believe, 3 ports that get opened because you have also the local workbench that is opened. All right, so let's move forward. If you try to debug the solution on your local machine and you get an error message like this, that's probably because you haven't either installed the certificate to trust your machine, or if you look at the traffic on your machine, you'll actually see, and this would be on your local machine, you'll see that there's like a failed error message in your HTTP traffic because it's trying to get the manifest for your web part. All you really need to do is open that URL in a separate tab, and that depends on the browser, but open it, and then you'll notice it's probably saying something like this, right? Hey, I don't trust that thing, so I'm not going to let it run it. So obviously you need to make sure your certificate that's been created for you is trusted so that you can debug this, and if the demo gods are with me, you should be able to actually see your web part delivered. All right, so I know I'm going fast, but there's a lot of concepts to explain here. So how does this magic happen? Well, the first thing is behind the scenes, these remote containers are done using Docker. So you would have to install Docker desktop on your machine. But again, we'll talk maybe in future sessions about what's the potential for even having some of these containers in the cloud and or shared. Just keep in mind, Docker has recently changed their licensing or pricing structure. So you have to make sure that you're following the right pricing. There is a certain charge if you're an enterprise user. But again, that's a Docker thing that I will leave it up to you. But the other component to this magic solution is that there is a extension that's currently in preview for Visual Studio Code that is called Remote Containers. And that's the thing that added that little bar at the bottom that allowed me to go back and forth between containers, local containers, and remote containers. Now, the other thing that you'll notice is the samples that are dev container enabled will actually have a dev container folder and a dev container.json, which actually uses the Docker images that have been created for you. What you'll see is we have in the Docker organization, we now have an M365PnP/SPFx organization where we've taken the definition of every single version of SPFx and we've created, this is something that Waldeck has been doing ever since the first version of SharePoint framework. He's actually been maintaining Docker containers for every single version of SharePoint framework. So they're pre-configured with the right version of Node and everything. And as you can see, there's quite a few containers here. So what we do is we bind to those containers for you, so we don't have to have a copy of a giant virtual machine. And then we have a script that we run at the start of every container to go do all the stuff that we just saw, installing the dependencies, setting up the trust certificates, converting the certificates for Windows and non-Windows devices, and other things like that. All right. Now, if you're wondering, okay, Hugo, that was way too quick. How do I do this? Well, every sample that is container enabled, and soon to be every single sample, in the minimal path to awesome, there is a section that says, hey, if you want to do this sample as a vscode-remote development, go to this URL, right? And it'll actually walk you through the steps on how to set this up. And I think this is kind of what it looks like. Now, again, all this stuff is in preview, right? We're trying to innovate quickly. We don't want Perfection be the enemy of innovation. But what's next with this? Well, first thing is all web part samples are going to be not converted, but enabled soon. The one thing that I want to make clear is we are actually testing that every web part works in a container, so that, again, people that are having issues with opening old samples or samples with different versions of Node will be able to do this. We're also going to be extending to the other repositories, the extensions, adaptive cards, and the Teams samples where applicable, because not all Teams samples are going to be suited. All right, so that's it for me for today. I wanted to thank a few people really helped me with this. Don Kirkham actually jumped in over a weekend to just, I guess I touched a sensitive nerve, and he pretty much dropped everything to help me solve this issue. Gary Trinder, as always, as soon as you mention something that sounds potentially difficult, he just has to do it in like half an hour just to show that, it's not difficult. Waldek, who's actually been supporting all these Docker containers from the inception of SPFx, and Paul Schaeflin, who I think a couple of years ago brought up the idea and opened an issue in the sample repository to say, hey, it would be cool if we could do this. The technology was not quite there yet when we first started talking about it, but now it's available. So to find out more information, you can go read more about Visual Studio Code remote development, because this is not unique to SharePoint framework. This is something you can use in other contexts. And if you want to read more about how to run these samples in remote containers, you can go to the link that is provided in every README, or you can go to this URL here. That's it for me for today. Thank you for your patience, and have a great day.
Thank you, Hugo, for that. Very great work by everybody to enable those scenarios with the containers. Hopefully that'll help some folks out trying out the samples. So really, really cool to see that coming along.